Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Richard Lewis Show. I'm your host, Richard Lewis, and joining me today, and I am very excited about this, I have Batya Ungar-Sargon, who is the author of the upcoming book, Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, which will be available to purchase on the 11th of November. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon. And she makes her day-to-day checks at Newsweek currently, I believe. So, Batya, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really looking forward to having this conversation because I think that, we've both identified that there is a serious problem in the American media landscape right now.
So thank you so much for having me. It's always such a pleasure to hear from somebody whose expertise is not my expertise.
Right.
And
yeah.
I'm like truly honored to have been invited on your show. And I do want to ask you though, so I was trying to do my homework and find out about you and where you might be coming to this conversation from. And because I'm such an embarrassing ignoramus on the question of video games and gaming and esports and all of the areas of your expertise, I found it really hard to decipher in kind of layman's terms, like where you're at politically. So I would love for you to sort of orient me towards where you're coming to this conversation from. And I'm sure it will be really interesting to your viewers as well.
Oh, I mean, look, so I get asked that a lot. And I think, the first thing I would say is it's probably hard for me to orient myself politically anyway in the current landscape, because, I grew up in what they call the Labour heartlands, the Labour Party in the UK. So definitely a lefty, former member of the Socialist Workers' Party, by the way. I used to pay my dues for that. Went on all the marches as a youngster. But, somewhere along the line, you start to realize what's realistic and what isn't. And I don't think that's the machine changing you. I think it's that you accept that radical change is never a possibility unless you want to live in a country where they have, violent coups d'etats and things like that. So I wouldn't say the dial moved a great deal for me, but I did notice in about 2015, 2016, I've always been, I thought I was progressive, right? I grew up with, Indian family. Even though I grew up in a part of the world where it wasn't particularly racially diverse, I never had a racist bone in my body. I mean, it helped that my father was in prison. He was really racist. He was an arsehole.
Wow.
So he wasn't around to raise me. I think I rejected a lot of that because of him. And then it got to 2015, 2016. And I was living in America at the time. I was working for TBS on a TV show. And that was, of course, when the madness started to set in. And I was looking at what was progressive and what was liberal and left-leaning. And increasingly, I was like, it's not me. I'm standing still. All my values remain true. And these motherfuckers are going off over the horizon. And it's crazy. And so that's kind of what I feel happened. I think there's a lot of people like me who we get called Nazis now, and we're the people that essentially constructed the left out of socialist worker ideology. And yet we're told we're repulsive human beings by this new, extremely radical and fervent group of the left. So it's really hard because, I'll be honest with you, I listen to the occasional Tucker Carlson monologue and find myself nodding my head, which I don't know how to reconcile that as a journalist that was brought up to naturally be critical of Fox News. So I don't know. I guess you'd have to tell me where I am politically. I'm really not so sure.
It's so interesting because I think that you exist in the exact place that has been sort of erased from the public conversation. And so it's so fascinating that you're sort of both coming at this from the UK, but also from that working class point of view, that the new left, the new progressive left, which, Thomas Piketty calls it a Brahmin left for a reason, right? Because it's made up these highly educated elites who have no idea what it's like to be working class and have engaged in this sort of mass deplatforming of working class views and voices. But I'm sorry, I have to hear more about your father and that and what that was like growing up and how that influenced you. That's so interesting.
Well, I mean, it's pretty much what it says. He was young. Grew up in a really abusive household. I mean, I went to visit him a few times in prison. I think the last time I saw him, I was 17. And he grew up in a really abusive household, domestic abuse against his mother. So his first spell in prison was actually for stabbing his own father. And so he just went off the rails when he got out, couldn't get a job, the cycle. And obviously, I think he fell in a little bit with the National Front types, because that was a time in history when, of course, jobs, we had people who'd come in to fill a job deficit from the Commonwealth. And obviously, when that changed and there was an economic shift, he was obviously, affected by that as an unskilled former convict. And so he was one of the people that these radical right-wing groups prey upon, the disaffected working class. And so obviously, I mean, even at age 12, I could put together what had happened. It's like they were never going to get me, because I was super aware of how they operate and the bullshit and the rhetoric that was predicated on it. So that's why, like, when people call me a Nazi or a racist or right wing, it rankles a bit more than it probably should, I think. Wow,
what a story. My gosh. I mean, like, you talk about having credibility to speak to this issue. You have it really in spades.
That's so very kind of you to say.
Have you written about this?
The funny thing is, because it started to creep into my world, in video games, we saw a lot of, the worst thing that ever happened to journalism, I think, was you got all the college bloggers, of which I was one, with no training, and they sort of just merged into the media set. And unfortunately, American academia seems to be promoting some really fucking wacky ideas. There is no getting away from that. And so that has spilled over into even what I do. I mean, there's a review. I'll probably share it with you just so you can get an idea of what our landscape looks like. And it was in Variety, and they had to review a game called The Division 2, which is, Tom Clancy, men with guns, CIA operatives, all that nonsense, And they didn't want to review it. So instead they said, The Division 2 reminds me of Tucker Carlson. Here's why Tucker Carlson is bad for America. And it's like, this is garbage. Like, why isn't an editor saying, I asked you to review the game? And, so it's everywhere. It's become ubiquitous. These American, fresh from academia. I get it. I admire the moxie, but your ideas are rotten, is my opinion.
So I have a theory about why academia and rotten ideas go together so well. So I don't know if you know this, but I got a PhD. I like to say I got a PhD in nonsense, because it really was in absolute nonsense. And the reason for that is because, so I got a PhD in literature. And I mean, I'm sure you know all this, but like, in order to get a PhD in literature in America, you have to come up with something new. Like, you have to come up with something new about the text you're working on. I was working on 18th century texts. So what that means is that for 200, 300 years, people who were smarter than me have been talking about the books that I had to come up with something new to say about. Right. What that means is that everything that is true about those books has pretty much already been said, right? Somebody smarter than me came up with the thing that is correct about this book in like 1925, but you can't get a PhD by writing a book that says, actually, Carlyle got it right in 1925, case closed, right? So the premium in all of the humanities are like this. The premium is on saying something interesting, and it really doesn't matter whether or not it's true. In fact, it can't really be true because, like I said, all the true things have been said. And so there is this kind of emphasis on, being interesting, being provocative, being counterintuitive, as opposed to trying to figure out what you really think about something. And I think that actually comes back to class, because so in America, we have this enormous class chasm that's really opened up between the college educated and everybody else. And a certain segment of the college educated has become actually increasingly very affluent. And I think that is sort of something that really has accelerated this, what I talk about in my book. And it comes back to class, because if you look at the ideas that have been deplatformed from American life, it's ideas that have a lot of sort of intuitive sense, right? Like, for example, gender, right? The idea that like there's a difference between men and women, right? Like that exists. This is the kind of thing that you sort of, it's a common sense view that, 99% of working class Americans hold, right? But what's happened is it's straight out of academia, is like everything that's commonsensical has to be questioned. It's the very counterintuitive take, that actually gender is a choice you make. That's the thing that becomes like, not only premium, volume, but now sort of increasingly taboo to contradict it. And so you have this kind of this operation going on now. And I don't think it's centralized. Like, obviously these people think they're doing good. They think they're standing up for the disenfranchised or whatever, but because people who increasingly have this education, this elite education, have so much cultural power, such a lock on the culture, what essentially happens is 90% of Americans have had their opinions almost overnight become taboo.
So I was gonna prep you before we got into the show, but we were talking about Lucy, your cat, yes, who I'm sure is going to make a cameo appearance at some point. But look, this is a little bit of a combative question, so I apologize for it. But I think it's a good rhetorical device. What business does a journalist that writes for a mainstream publication have pointing out the problem in the news?
I mean, aren't I the perfect person to do it because I have an insider point of view? It's kind of like
I agree.
Let me just put it this way. People often say to me like, "Oh, why are you criticizing the left? You're on the left." It's exactly like Tucker Carlson does not care what I think about his show and when he goes too far and when he's making a good point. Like that, I have no ability to influence the side I'm not on, like, who cares what somebody who's like, I mean, sure. It's an authority fallacy, right? We should care about a good argument wherever it comes from, but I'm invested in the left because I'm of the left, probably like you, because I really, really care about the working class and the downtrodden and downward economic mobility. And so I feel like it's the same thing with journalism. Like same thing with New York Times. I really criticize the New York Times very heavily in my book. I am extremely invested in that institution. I mean, it hasn't done my people very good, over the years. They buried the Holocaust to start with, right? Yep. But I'm very, very invested in that institution. And so I feel like, a lot of people have sort of been like, forget it, to the toilet, none of this matters. And I wouldn't have written the book if I felt that way.
So what your fellow lefties would say is why is specifically the woke news media the danger to America and not something like, say, for example, Fox News or listen, I for my sins I did 6 months at Breitbart, so just so you know. That was in 2015. I was on the front lines of the culture war and I'd stood on the wrong side. So, Fox, Breitbart, and these new ones coming through now, like OAN, which, I mean, they're a joke. Newsmax, things like this.
I imagine that you worked at Breitbart because you made a mistake from the right reasons, which is you understood that there was an enormous class divide and that for some reason conservative media was on the right side of it. Now, conservative media are no heroes, but if you look at the difference between CNN and Fox, and I know this because I have them both up on screens in front of me all day, every day, because I'm an opinion editor. My job is to follow the conversation. If you look at them, the major difference between them, it's not political, it's class. It's about whether or not they imagine their viewer has a college degree. And they're right about this. Obviously, they're following the data to find out, and they are creating programming Fox is creating programming for the working class. That's what, the New York Times loves running articles like Fox News is turning my mom's brain to mush, or, is turning conservatives, is turning the working class into conservative zombies, when the truth is the exact opposite. Fox News is conservative because it caters to the working class, and the working class is more conservative because they don't go to universities and develop kooky ideas, that are like inversions of reality, like, that America is founded on racism, right? Like something like that. Which is obviously not to deny the enormous amounts of racism in our history, but just, like that's another sort of classic academic inversion, right? The idea that the Constitution is a document of, oppression, right? Rather than an imperfectly enforced document of freedom.
It's kind of strange. People don't seem to grasp this. It's like there's economically conservative, which I don't think a lot of, in my experience, a lot of the working class people in America are, because they definitely want to tax the rich.
Completely.
They definitely want to have better facilities, as we found out during the, shanked in the showers Bernie Sanders DNC campaign 2 times around. We found out that people want free fucking healthcare because, of course, right? So they're not economically conservative. And one of the magic tricks I see a lot of lefties do these days is they say, how can the working class be conservative? And they're talking about economics, not values and not beliefs. And I think we're only the working class is more conservative, but only conservative by the same phenomenon I experienced. That again, I would have everything I believed was real liberal 10, 15 years ago. It just isn't now.
Well, so I totally agree with you. So in that kind of the four quadrants, right, where you have one axis measures social issues and one axis measures economic issues. So in America, we're divided pretty equally between three of those. There are people who are socially liberal and economically liberal, meaning they want there to be like, marriage equality, although most Americans want marriage equality now, super left on issues of identity, and also what's known as liberal politically, meaning like they want a social safety net, they want healthcare, they want $14 minimum wage. Then there's the sort of socially liberal, economically conservative, who are people who are sort of like libertarians. And yes, there is, a quarter of Americans who are independents, who want there to be like, marriage equality. They're very liberal on social issues. They don't want the government getting involved. And they also, want there to be like zero government intervention in welfare or anything sort of backing people up. Then there's the Democratic Party represents that first one, right? Mm-hmm. Socially liberal, economically liberal. The Republicans represent the one that's next to that, which is socially conservative and economically conservative. There's only 3% of the American population in that quadrant, which is people who have socially conservative values, but also want there to be no government spending on people who are poor, people who are struggling. Right. Yeah. There is a quarter of Americans in this top quadrant who we never hear from, who are socially conservative, they are religious, and they are also economically liberal, meaning they want a $15 minimum wage. So you take a state like Florida that went overwhelmingly for Donald Trump, and they voted at the same time on that same ballot to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. That upper quadrant is totally ignored. And you're exactly right. These people, they want healthcare, but they are so deeply insulted by the way liberals talk to them, the way liberals think about their values, that they are completely not willing to vote for them. And I think at the same time, the Democrats really did abandon them for many years. I mean, the last 30 years, 40 years, where you had things like outsourcing and offshoring of manufacturing and globalization, and basically sending all these amazing jobs, 5 million amazing jobs to China, right? That was Democrats who did that. So what I say about the difference between CNN and Fox News, or between liberal media and conservative media, is that neither of them is catering to the economic plight of the working class, but at least the conservative media is not insulting them, is not sneering at them while abandoning them. I mean, that's what the Democrats did. They abandoned them economically, and then they called them racists. Yeah. Like, it was just like, so that's to your point. The reason I think that woke media is the problem is because it's not because Fox News is catering to their, is actually taking working class economic agenda seriously. It's because woke media is essentially perpetuating a moral panic around race that does nothing to help racial minorities. It does nothing to solve, any of the remaining areas of racism that we have in America that desperately need to be addressed. What it does do is it allows them off the hook. It allows them to ignore the class chasm. And so it allows this economic inequality, this like encroaching oligarchy that America is becoming, to perpetuate while they see themselves as the heroes of the social justice movement, right? It's this amazing magic trick. And I just want to emphasize, I don't think people are doing that in like a, we're going to get money and power by pretending to represent the downtrodden. Like it's, they really believe that what they're doing is right. Like they really believe that like Ibram X. Kendi is going to show them the way to a more equitable America. They don't realize that like not only is his, his ideas dehumanizing to white and Black Americans, but that they are actually just a smokescreen that allows inequality to persist and to even get worse.
So then the next question would be, because so few journalists do speak out about this, although I'm sure there's like an abundance of them that understand it. Are you afraid of becoming something of a pariah in the social set, and maybe even having your job jeopardized? I wanted to talk a little bit about what happened to Bari Weiss, with how she was essentially bullied out of the newsroom. By this new breed of woke journalists, where it's like everybody must share this one opinion, this one dogmatic view of the world. And if you address the elephant in the room that, some of this is a bit flimsy, they will go after you with way more than they even go after the supposed targets, the racists,
Yeah, I mean, I've already had things like that happen to me. It's horrible, but I'm religious, so I'm like, I answer to a different, like if you end up in a situation where you are answering to Twitter, something else fundamentally has gone wrong in your life. And I really admire Barry. I really respect her. That wouldn't happen at Newsweek, because Newsweek's entire raison d'etre right now is anti-cancel culture. It was bought by essentially a British Indian billionaire who hates cancel culture. So we're very lucky. He wants us to be hosting debates. And like, so I feel that they would be very, strongly against any cancellation attempts. Okay. I already feel like a pariah amongst, woke journalists, but it's so funny because I think it's even worse with me, like, because you said you haven't changed. I changed. So I was a woke journalist for a long time before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I
didn't come across anything egregious, by the way, Batya. I did my research. I didn't see anything where I went, oh wow, she lost her mind. I didn't see anything like that.
I think it's more like I've always had this internal conflict because I'm of the class that I'm critiquing.
Right.
And so it's very hard to say to, like, let's say a person of color who is speaking in woke language and for, speaking as though they're representing, a community I care about a lot, which is the descendants of slaves in America. I know from polling that these woke views do not represent that community in the least, right? Yeah. I mean, it's like an infamous example now is defund the police, which was all you could read about in the New York Times when 81% of Black Americans are really, really, really opposed to that idea. But it's very hard in the face of a person who is sort of suffering or who is portraying themselves as a speaker on behalf of a community that I care a lot about. Like, it's very hard not to descend into those like very woke white liberal emotions. And I know in my head that it is dehumanizing. And I'll give you an example of like one of my first aha moments was a study came out of Yale. Do you know about this study that found a major difference in how white liberals and white conservatives talk to Black and Latino people?
I think I might have talked about this on my other podcast, actually.
Basically, they found that white liberals dumb down their vocabulary when speaking to people of color.
Well, I mean, it was emblazoned by that AOC moment, right? When she, hi, y'all, and she came out. And, mega cringe.
Yeah. And it's, I remember reading that and being like, what kind of a sick ideology produces people who literally dumb down their language? And the people we're calling racists don't do it. Like, what, you know what I mean? Something is really, really off here. Like, something is really off here. And of course, that too stems from this like white guilt, like this desire to live in a more equitable society. Like, I have all this privilege. Maybe I don't want to make somebody feel bad. Maybe they won't understand this word or whatever it is, but it is sick. It's a sickness, And so, but I can still remember those feelings. Like, it's very, I feel like I have this central conflict where I know it's terrible and dehumanizing. Of course, like my Black friends are like, yes, it's terrible and dehumanizing. But on the other hand, like, it's very easy to descend into those feelings and then be like, am I sure I'm on the right side? And of course, because that's my job, is to like get pieces from across the political spectrum. My job is to a certain extent to always be asking, like, are you sure you're right about this? What would convince you that you were wrong? So.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that point as well, I think the problem we've got in journalism, and like, I know I only write about video games and whatnot, right? But I've always tried to take on big targets in that industry. So I do, investigative journalism, match fixing, breach of contract, abuse of esports players.
That stuff's important, man.
It is
important.
You're never gonna win any awards on it. But I always took it seriously. Like, I never thought of myself as like a video games journalist. I was always a journalist that wrote about video games, which I think is like an intro. That psychologically, I needed that qualifier to kind of justify what I did to myself. But the American institutions around journalism are completely rotten, it seems to me now. We always talk about the Pulitzer Prize, and, you look at what happened with the 1619 Project. This is ridiculous. It wins a Pulitzer. It's factually inaccurate. It was essentially a theory anyway, right? It was like a new way of reframing history, which is fine. But it contained a number of factual inaccuracies to arrive at the conclusion. It was serialized in the New York Times and heralded as like the best piece of journalism of all time. It was taught in schools despite being factually inaccurate. And it's like, someone has to say something about that. Somebody really has to pipe up, because there is an inherent danger there that we're going to get to a point in journalism where something can be factually incorrect, but ethically correct. And that's more important. And then there's no point in doing what we do anymore.
So I think I felt that way very much over the whole Tom Cotton op-ed.
Yeah, great example.
I felt like you were watching a mass delusion happen. And everybody knew it was a delusion, but you had to say the sentence or you would lose your job. Like, it was a really like Maoist moment, it felt like. With the 1619 Project, I feel very mind divided about it. I find Nicole Hannah Jones's essay about her father's patriotism so moving and poignant, and such a rebuke to what the project became. So when I think of the project, I think it became this kind of cultural touchstone. I mean, very much she wanted it to, but I also can't get past how I felt when I first read that essay. It brought tears to my eyes, like this noble man's refusal to give up on this country and its ideals, despite what it had put him through, and his daughter's struggle with that. Like, it was such a beautiful essay. And yeah, it had that mistake in it. And then the Times really doubled down on it, as you say. And then the Pulitzer Committee awarding it a Pulitzer, which I do feel ambivalent about, because I think that maybe they, it's undeniable that the impact, good or bad, of that project was enormous. Perhaps the most impactful piece of journalism of the year, if not,
Oh, I mean, certainly, and you can't dispute that. I mean, I guess for me, how I always feel about journalism is, if something is in, because my stories, I've got a 100% accuracy record over a 16-year career. I mean, like, I am absolute. I'm insanely cautious, and it's mainly because younger people in my industry don't understand that actually a journalist won't go their entire career and without making a mistake or having an error or having to issue a correction or a retraction. But if you do that in my industry, you're dead. You're gone. No one will take you seriously again. So the kids will just point to that one mistake you made, because that's what they're conditioned to do with Twitter. And they'll never shut the fuck up about it. So I am insane. There's like so many stories I've never written because I'm like, it's not all the way there. It's, and I can't afford to get anything wrong. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a hang up with me. But for me, I think when we start giving out awards to things we acknowledge are factually inaccurate, and we start holding them up as examples of the type of journalism we want to create, I worry for an industry that's already struggled with accuracy horrifically the last 5-6 years.
So let me give you my counter take to that. Okay. And I'm really interested what you think about this. So my book opens with the penny press, which basically in America in the 19th century was a time actually much like our own of like rampant and like truly disgusting income inequality. And this guy, Benjamin Day, showed up, and he was a printer. And like most printers at the time, he was from, a poor family. His father had apprenticed him out when he was 14 years old. And he came to New York City, and he started working for one newspaper and then another newspaper. And he realized that like all the newspapers were really just catering to the economic and the political elites, right? And they were very expensive. You couldn't really buy them in the streets. So you had to subscribe, and a yearly subscription was $10. And like the average made like $5 a month, right? So it was basically really just for the rich. And he had this like idea. He was like, but there are so many poor and working class people here, like, and they have nothing to read. Like, they just have nothing to, but there are so many of them. And he was like, what if I got a newspaper and created a paper that was for them, that would cost 1 penny, and maybe they only have 2 pennies. But what he realized was there was a kind of like dignity in asking someone for one of their pennies if they only had 2, if what you were going to give them was going to be worth it. And a penny was very little. I mean, it was like, an apple cost a penny, or like a little skein of thread cost a penny. So he started this penny press. He sold out like the first day. It became clear that he was going to become extremely wealthy doing this. And what he did was he hired this guy to go sit in the daybreak court and to cover just as the police would bring in the criminals that they had rounded up overnight. And he would just record like what they would say in their defense and what the crime was. And so he had this whole like basically he was gossiping about the poor and the working classes, and he made them feel like they were worthy of being gossiped about. I mean, he really created like, this sense of like what a public is. And he got really rich doing it. And Joseph Pulitzer sort of picked up his mantle, 30 years later. He was the second generation to do that, really meeting the Gilded Age. Sorry, here's Lucy's made
it's
her
all right, we know.
appearance.
Yeah, the first of many, I'm sure.
Basically greeting the inequality of the Gilded Age with essentially, the idea that the poor and the working class deserve attention and they need somebody to be crusades on their behalf. And the reason I bring this up is because these guys, Pulitzer actually, he really cared about accuracy. Benjamin Day did not. He cared about a good story. But moreover, obviously, I think accuracy is extremely important to journalism. We often hear the complaint that it's sort of like that partisanship is tearing apart our journalism. Like it used to be that like there was one paper for everybody, and now it's each person gets their information from their silo. And to me, the problem is not with a partisan journalism. It's with a journalism that's partisan on behalf of the rich, which is what all of our journalism is today. So at the time of like Pulitzer and Day, they were very partisan on behalf of the working class. And it was okay because they were partisans on behalf of the elites, right? There was a time in 1920s New York where there were so many communist newspapers that the communists could be like, that's the communist drag that I would never dream of picking up, like it was like so niche, like each communist version of like their, version of the Communist Manifesto. So I think to me today, the problem is that like you have, like the top 5% of, conservatives have great representation in politics and great representation in the media. The top 5% who are liberals have excellent representation in the media and in politics. The 90% of Americans who are not in the top 10% have nobody speaking for them. And I'll just make one more quick point because I'm actually really interested in what you think about this. You see a lot of liberal proposals. It's very clear when the Democrats started leaning into a college educated base, right? Yeah. When they sort of had that kind of reversal from representing labor and the working class to representing sort of the upper middle class. And you see it today, even from progressives. Like that's why I call like the Squad, for example, the patron saints of the Brahmin left, because they're everything, if you look at what they're pushing, this is for highly educated liberals, like things like $50,000 in student loan forgiveness. Like who has $50,000 in loans already? It's not working class Americans, right? Leaning into the college educated. Even a lot of the environmental policy is pitting working class jobs, good working class jobs, against the sort of vanity of the elites. Another thing is immigration. Immigration has been coded in America as like, if you believe there should be a national border, that's considered racist. There's been this mission creep of racism. When obviously, when you ask working class people, like, what is your opposition to immigration? It's like, well, I'm going to lose my job, and they are going to lose their job. Like they're not wrong about that. So you have this sort of like, and just the final point I'll make is like, even a lot of the welfare proposals, the American working class is conservative. And so even the ones who vote for liberals, they believe in autonomy. Like they want good jobs. They don't want more SNAP benefits. They don't want more, like healthcare is important, yes, but they don't want to see more free housing. They want jobs. They want the dignity that comes from working and contributing and building up this country. And it feels to me a lot like this sort of big tech inflected new left, even the progressives, things like universal basic income, like what they would like to see is a sort of quiescent working class that no longer has a job and no longer has a role in building this country, and thus can be more easily manipulated and doesn't have the ability to do something like elect a Donald Trump or do a Brexit, for example. Right, all right, what do you think about all of that?
Well, I mean, look, so I mean, you can see it. It's a great time to actually have that discussion because it's being reflected in what's happening right now under the Biden administration. Because all he wants to talk about is infrastructure, which of course would benefit the working class in a lot of areas.
Definitely, yeah.
But of course, no one gives a fuck about that because gas is over $4 a gallon.
Yeah.
And so there is a unfortunate reality that I know liberal, elite, college educated, the upper middle class and beyond don't understand, and that is that the bottom line will influence politics greatly for the bulk of voters, because we're all living on that line.
Yeah.
And you know, I know about this, for, you know, by way of it, for instance, where I grew up in a mining town, you know, we'll never vote Conservative in Britain. Never. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what Labour do to us. And trust me, they've done a lot, because I lived through the Tony Blair years, and sort of that's where my political hopes were dashed against the wall like a Spartan throwing a baby off a cliff. You know, it was gone at that point. It was a complete betrayal of the working class. We got Conservatives in red ties. But you know, we can't vote Conservative because they're the ones that close the mines. They're the ones that condemned a generation of men to committing suicide because they couldn't figure out how to type or code. You know, so we can't vote Conservative. We can't. They killed us. You know.
So what we have in America is, imagine if Labor had closed the mines. That's essentially what happened here under Clinton and Obama. And I don't think I don't think they could have foreseen it, or maybe they could have. But that's when the shift happened. And it's so funny. You have books like "What's the Matter with Kansas? Why are these people like voting against their economic interests?" And it's like, because you abandoned their economic interests and then you sneered at them. Yeah.
Which in many ways, you know, I think that's the interesting part about it, because it's like, you know, you see all these politicos, you know, I'm sure you know the Washington types all too well, and they consider themselves incredibly smart. I mean, they really do. I mean, they think, you know, they've got all the people behind the scenes. I'm not even talking about the politicians. Politicians, by and large, are morons, but they have really good apparatus behind them to make them appear like they're not morons, to essentially deceive the populace into thinking this is a good person to put in charge of things and represent my interests. But what I can't understand is the level of incompetence. I mean, it's quite staggering, really, to think that you can act against the working class interest while being the party of the working class, and that it's a good idea to routinely, and I don't mean once or twice, I mean all the time, come out and rebuke the working class for the things they believe. I can't believe we're arguing about Latinx, for example. What are you fucking thinking? This is not, you know, do you ever want to see Florida? You know, so like that's only going to go one way if you keep that shit up. And it's just, there has to be, where are the intelligent people that can just simply do a quick head count? Yes. Okay, everyone hates that. Let's abandon it. That's all you have to do. That's all you have to do, and it just informs your policy and it's fixed. That's it. But no, they're not there in Washington. They're going, yes, we should really, we'll win them over. We'll win over the Latinos and the Latinas to Latinx. We'll win them over. Never in a million, not in my lifetime. I'll be long dead in the grave before anyone who adopts that outside of this tiny little subset of American people, right?
I have to say, I think one of my most cancelable beliefs is like, I'm glad that a lot of working class people of color voted for Trump, not because I wanted him to win again, but because I want the Democrats to vote, to have to earn their votes instead of taking them.
This is what I say all the time. It's why people didn't understand it. I think Hillary Clinton is despicable. I think she's one of the most corrupt politicians potentially in my lifetime. I mean, that's a pretty high bar, so that might be hyperbole. But again, it's like, the reason I was telling people you should probably vote for Trump is you have a choice. You have a corrupt politician and you have a corrupt businessman who's never been in politics. Mm-hmm. Give the corrupt businessman the chance to maybe not be corrupt in politics rather than re-elect the corrupt politician within politics. That seems to me to be the forget the fact that, yes, I'd dismantled the two-party system. I think there's something very wrong with American politics where you can end up with, who are the best two people who run the country? Hillary fucking Clinton or Donald fucking Trump. Like, you've got a problem. It's, you know, like, but at the end of the day, if you re-elect corrupt politicians, you deserve it when they give it to you good and hard. It's your fault. So
but I'll just say, even on that topic, Trump's economic policies were, if Bernie Sanders had been elected in 2016, his economic platform would have looked a lot like Trump's.
Yes.
Not the early tax cut, which actually I thought was very Scandinavian. I mean, they have very low corporate tax rates, and that's sort of, Trump lowered the corporate tax rate and created a lot of jobs. Okay, I'm not an economist, so I don't know if that contributed, but I think maybe it did. But what he did was he renegotiated NAFTA, which was a terrible trade agreement. And the new NAFTA is the most pro-trade, pro-worker, pro-labor trade agreement America has ever signed, right? So Bernie used to be obsessive about getting rid of NAFTA, right? Trump started a trade war with China. Do you know how many, what cojones that took? Like no Democrat and no Republican would have had the guts to do that. Bernie maybe, because Bernie was talking about those jobs, right? And then he tried to close the border. Bernie Sanders in 2015, he gave his interview to Ezra Klein, and Ezra Klein was like, shouldn't we have open borders if you really care about the poor? And Bernie went, open borders? That's a Koch brothers proposal. Like that.
I remember that.
Shocked to hear those words coming out of a liberal's mouth, like open borders. What are you talking about? The Koch brothers would love to have, an influx of immigrants willing to work $2-3 an hour. And Bernie's like, those should be union jobs. And Trump did all of those things. And then, but because of the way American politics was shaking out, Bernie couldn't be like, well, actually, I really like these proposals. I'm going to support him. I'm going to help him out. Instead, he had to be out there being like, he is the most racist, homophobic, right? And it was sort of like, I don't blame Bernie, I don't blame him, because there was no way you could get up on a stage running against Donald Trump and be like, I too support, strong immigration laws, because
he's actually all right, is Don. Yeah, you can't say
exactly.
it. Yeah.
And it's like, obviously the family separation policy went too far and was really horrible. But the problem it was aiming to solve was a problem that we're now having again, which is people pick up some child who is not theirs and bring them to cross the border. And is that good for children? It's not good for children.
I just did a whole video about that, actually, because I think, again, it comes back to my point about there's so many idiots in Washington. The child separation policy was abhorrent, and I was vehemently against that. But the problem I find with the left is they never let the horror speak for itself. They don't trust you to get there intellectually, so they have to tell a lie. And so I've recorded a 2-hour video about this. It's just called Cages. And so the phrase "kids in cages" isn't the problem. I've seen children in cages in America for as long as I've followed politics. And I got into American politics probably in the Bill Clinton years, and I started writing about it. I was very, very, very big on it. And so we know about the border surge under Obama. We know that military bases were repurposed to house thousands of separated children. So if the problem is kids in cages, then talk the fuck about that. What you mean is the problem was child separation, and you didn't put that front and center, and that set you up for rebuttals from the right and made you look like fools. And there is a problem with immigration in America, and there is a dehumanizing aspect. You're inhumane if you look at a child, wrapped up in tinfoil with 18 other kids in chicken wire. Fuck that. That's ridiculous. And I understand that, there's a crisis at the border. I understand that this influx is creating problematic necessities. There's got to be a better way. And I haven't seen Republicans or Democrats even try in my lifetime. What they've got is functional, and that's what they'll do. And then they'll come out publicly and tell you how the other side is the cause. It's nonsense. So yeah, the left really need to get better slogans, I guess is the roundabout way of saying that, because all cops are bastard, defund the police, but we don't mean defund the police, we mean more funding actually, but you put it in different areas. What the fuck? Can no one come up with a coherent slogan in Washington anymore,
Well, I think defund the police was a really good slogan in that it conveyed exactly the truth of what it was, which was we don't know any people of color, and we don't live near any poor people, right?
Right. Yeah. But yeah, so I just to move on, because this conversation's been great. It's flying along, and I definitely want to get this in. Trump, okay, the big orange elephant in the room. Yes. Why did Trump break everyone's brains in media? Because you see, I think accuracy and wokeness are linked for reasons we'll get to. But as somebody, boots on the ground journalist that sort of witnessed it all, why did Donald Trump break everyone's brains?
I 100% think it was about class. It was the unwashed, unlettered masses having their way with a person who just basically refused the politesse that one has come to expect from the elite class. He refused to play by the games of that matter most to the media, which is the symbolic level, the symbolic honorifics. It's not about civility. Civility is extremely important, like that stuff is really important. I mean, of course, that was also part of it. He was also disgusting. He also said disgusting things to people, right? But I think the point is like our elites who, increasingly control information, in fact, completely control, the flow of information today, from big tech to the media to Hollywood to whatever, like they are completely in the symbolic register, the symbolic level, right? So, one of the points I make in my book is like, why are people obsessed with cancellations, like canceling people? Why does everybody want to read about this stuff? Why does it become like a New York Times article? And I think it's because like getting canceled for saying something infelicitous is the closest, a liberal elite will ever come to crime. They live lives completely separate from crime because America's become increasingly segregated by class in terms of where people live and by neighborhood, et cetera. And I think that sort of existing in the symbolic realm and the symbolic level, like they're obsessed with political correctness, right? And that matters so much more than policy. That matters so much more than really anything else. So he could say something racist, and I admit it's racist, and I believe it's bad for a candidate to say racist things. I didn't vote for him, but there is something undignified about it. The dignity of a community is minimized when your politician says gross things about you. As a Jewish person, that happened to us with Trump all the time. I can see, for Black people, for Latinos, like, yes, your dignity as a person is diminished when a politician speaks that way. But clearly for a lot of minorities, that dignity was not worth the money in their pocketbooks at the end of the month, like they were seeing real difference. The economy improved under Trump for the bottom 25% by 4.5%. Like that's huge. I mean, in one year, in 2019, right? So his economy really was working for the bottom. And I think that the media is in the top. They're in the elite. There's been a status revolution among journalists, sort of what my book is about, right? How they have ascended from used to be a working class trade to be a journalist. And today you essentially have to go to an elite university, come from, be the child.
I used to fantasize about being H.L. Mencken when I was like 16, So.
And I think that for people in the elites, like these symbolic issues are, like Trump is a poor person's fantasy of what a rich person is like. And these people who are actually rich liberals were like, this guy is disgusting. Like, how could you, like the fake hair, the fake tan, like the golden toilet, it's so crass, right? It's so lower class.
Ketchup on your steaks.
And I think it reflected, it was a populist movement that reflected in a way, the last gasp of the working class to try to get its issues back on the agenda. And I think that was truly horrifying for a lot of people.
I mean, so let me explain why I believe the two are linked. And again, I did a video on this. I started a new series called Enemy of the People, right? Which is a bit edgy, I know, but whatever. I'll lean into
but I want to hear this. But before that, would you say that this is a similar explanation for what happened in Brexit? Because my understanding is that it's very similar.
I mean, look, our friends across the pond. And remember, I was in America when Brexit happened.
Right.
And so for me, it was a weirdness because I went to bed. Right. I said to all my friends, like, listen, Brexit's not going to happen. Right. Just fucking relax. Right. No one's going to do this. I'm off to bed. Fuck it. I'm not sitting up and watching this bollocks with you. I'm in America. So I went to bed and I woke up and Brexit had happened. And I was like, right. Okay. That's mad. But you have to understand one aspect that Americans forget is we never had to have the vote. We held the referendum.
Right.
And the referendums aren't legally binding. It's just a survey, right? So David Cameron said, "Listen, if we agree that we should have a vote on it, I'll have a vote on it." Right. And he didn't even have to say that. Right. They could have just took the temperature, right? So this is like, imagine again, like Obama says, listen. I'll have a vote on whether or not I stand down. And if public opinion says I will, I will. Like, why would you ever do that? Why would you commit to anything as a politician? So they did that. David Cameron was like, okay, fuck it, we'll have the vote then. I guess I've got to now. So then they had the vote, and then that happened, and he was like, yeah, fuck this, I'm out. I can't. He just pieced out, right? So it's like, okay, so now what do we do? Mm-hmm. And we went through, different leaders. One aspect that was similar was the tantrums that were happening from the lefties. Because it was, and that was that. I can't believe they've done it. Can we have another vote, everybody? Can we do it again? Best of three, like that's what Remainers are like, unfortunately. And that's why a lot of people find them repellent, because it's ridiculous. We had a vote and the vote didn't go the way that you wanted it to. You can't just invalidate democracy when it's not for you. So yeah, there was that. But I mean, equally as well, I know of no American that would acquiesce to the sort of demands of the European Union. Imagine
completely.
It's a lot like what you were talking about with the NAFTA and all of that stuff. Imagine an entity outside of America, apart from China, of course. Imagine an entity outside of America that tells America what to do, right? And if you could uncouple yourself from that, how tempting would it be? Now, again, all the money-making conservatives that are going to do crony capitalism and give all their friends jobs in the resulting chaos, which is what happened under Boris Johnson's government, they're stoking that. The famous one is the lie on the side of a bus that, hey, we could give the NHS another £3.5 million a week if we absolute bollocks. It doesn't even work like that financially. So a lot of people felt there was going to be an economic resurgence, and I still think, and this is going to get me absolutely destroyed, but I still think it's too early to tell whether or not it was a good or a bad thing, because there's a lot of stuff going on in Brexit because of Brexit right now in the UK that's being blamed entirely on Brexit, and we're ignoring the fact we are in the middle of a global pandemic and global supply lines are shutting down and everything's economically changing and America's about to default on its debt and there's market uncertainty. No one's talking about that. We're just saying, oh look, Brexit's made it so there's no petrol in the petrol stations. Or gas, sorry. So yeah, it's I don't know. I think Brexit was much ado about nothing. I would have rather stayed in. I like being able to show my British passport in many countries around the world and just walk in. Some mad throwback to colonialism that we shouldn't have at all, but fine, I'll take the benefit. But I mean, by and large, does it affect how much does it affect the working class? It's probably barely moved the dial, if we're just being honest about it, so it's very hard for me.
You don't think it's like to me, it's a question of like, are you allowed to care more about the poor and working class in your own country than about the poor and working class of other countries? And
that is the fundamental existential question, I guess.
And it seems to me insane that somehow it was considered immoral in the case of Brexit and immoral here in terms of enforcing, the southern border. It's considered immoral to say I care more about the poor person who lives down the street from me than I do about a person who's maybe even suffering more, but who lives in another country who wants to come here for a better life for their child. That's now considered an immoral position. And I don't understand that at all. That to me, again, seems like one of these academic reversals, where it's like, isn't it obvious that you should care more about your neighbor? Isn't it obvious that national sovereignty is the only guarantee of civil rights? And when we start messing with what a border means, we all become endangered by that, But no, it's like AOC tweeted once, the history of citizenship in this country is itself racist. The concept of citizenship is itself racism now. I don't see that at all. And I feel but that's my entire class thinks that. I live in New York, right? You can't go to dinner parties in New York and say no, actually, I'm very worried about working class jobs. And I think if we had a strong border, we could have people who are we could have a union of hotel cleaning ladies, who could make $15 an hour and get benefits instead of people doing it for $3 an hour. Like Bernie said in 2015.
Are you a Bernie bro? Would you describe yourself that way?
So, I don't know, as a British person, you're not going to maybe relate to this at all, but so in 2016, I was still very woke. And so I was very Hillary. In 2019, I had come around to see how valuable and amazing Bernie's 2015 run had been. his 2019 run was very woke. He had brought on a lot of people. I think he got convinced that, his problem was a failure of like woke language. He brought in a lot of bad people, and along with a lot of the bad people, he brought on just a parade of anti-Semites. And I'm not even saying people who are like anti-Israel or people who support the boycott of Israel, people who had said really gross things about Jews controlling the world. And it was like one after another. And I don't think that was really his fault. I think he's a bad manager, which is probably one of his charms as well. But that made it very hard for me, because his the class-based platform, the view of elevating the voices of the working class, he's been doing that for 40 years, and I respect that so much. But it was like the flip-flop on immigration, which he didn't explain, which was part of the wokeness, which was not great. And then just all the anti-Semites he surrounded himself with. It was very heartbreaking for me, and a lot of Jews I know who are sort of on the left, center left, who really, are upset about this class chasm, but who find that hard.
I'll be honest with you. I find it amazing in America, actually, that the demographic of working class Jewish people is never really talked about. It's just
it's quite small, actually. It's not as big as, but it does.
But I've never heard it addressed. When you think about all the other, like in America, the thing that I always found shocking about American politics is the way everyone is put into a demographic, and then they have all this data about you, no matter how big or how small. And they just openly say, I hate the term blacks. I hate that. Like that makes black people, please. But they just see, even MSNBC, this is how blacks think, and we've got all the data. I'm like, guys, what the fuck is going on here? Right. But in obviously having been to New York on a few occasions, I totally get it. There was a lot of working class Jewish people that I know were in for Trump.
Yes, absolutely.
Purely because of things you're talking about. How can they stand with Bernie when he's bringing in people that are literally, they're talking about actual neo-Nazi conspiracy theories and just kind of open speech? Outrageous. But if you were to listen, I think, to a lot of politicos, they don't really talk about working class Jewish people so much.
No, never. And also because the Jewish community is so heavily slanted towards the liberal side, they're sort of very embarrassed by both the working class side of part of the community and the conservative Republican Trump voting part of the community, which of course also contains, billionaires like, former Sheldon Adelson or whatever. It's not all, working class, but, you have a lot of Jews who are from like places that are were actual totalitarian societies, Uzbekistan, which was under Soviet Union, or people who come from Iran, people come from Syria who are Jewish, who are all totally in for Republicans. And you would have this situation where you would have these liberals saying to them, how could you vote for a literal Nazi? And they're like, we literally come from totalitarian regimes. You're lecturing us about autocrats. I'm from Iran. You're lecturing me about who is an autocrat. It was hilarious.
Yeah, I think there's a weird. I think one of the things that, and this is just a point, although if you can tell me what you think about it, but what I've always felt is that because the last real true, the closest proximity Americans have come to fascist boots on their land is the British. It's us. Right? There's this insane fantasy that they have, ooh, oppress me, daddy, and it's like, no, they use the fascist word all the time, and it's like, guys, please shut the fuck up. For a European, stop now, right? Because it just isn't true.
That's so funny.
But do you think there's a weird hang up on this notion of fascism in America because of the history?
I think that we're very spoiled, and that because our discourse is set so much by people from such a tiny elite, it really, really fails to represent. I'll give you another example. So CNN in 2012, CNN and Fox News both had only 25% of their audience didn't have a college degree. Okay, since then, in 2019, Fox News still only 25% of their audience has a college degree. CNN, it's now up to 50%, which means that over the last 9 years, they did something that conveyed to their audience, we're no longer for you, to working class liberals, right? What I'm trying to say is that 25% that they lost of people without a college education who used to watch CNN, those were working class liberals, right? That's who they lost, because CNN has always been liberal. So where did they go? You know, some of them no doubt went to Fox, but a lot of them, for working class liberals, there's no media that's created for them. All of the sort of national news media is all going for that same, you know, top 10%, highly educated, affluent, coastal, big city dwelling, you know, millennial and higher, who are like in information age jobs. And if you're like a working class liberal, you literally have nothing to read. Like there's really no outlet that's catering to you. Like they don't want your money. Like
yeah.
And then people complain.
They openly reject it as well. And then,
exactly.
and then they're like, God, why can't we just monetize good journalism anymore? Yeah, mental, crazy. So look, back to journalism, yes. Because, you know, it's great to talk about the American political landscape because it is uniquely fascinating. Earlier, I said, I think the wokeness and the inaccuracies are linked.
Yes,
and I did a show about this where I went through every major story about Trump that was wrong in his first year. It's a 2-hour video. It was fucking long. And that was skipping over some of them. So it's unbelievable. And something happened in 2015, 2016, where journalists gave themselves permission to be wrong as long as they were on the right side. And that is another reason why I worry about this inaccuracy trend, if you like. But I don't think you can give yourself permission unless you are a devotee of the Church of Wokeness, right? I mean, that's the first part of the problem. You ascribe to this belief, you go into the journalistic talent pool, you're given these stories, and you rush to judgment, which a journalist should never do, because you know this guy's bad. You know they're right-wing. You know they're Republican. You know what they're up to. So I may as well just fucking write it up like that. And then, oh, I was wrong. Okay, well, doesn't matter. I'm not going to get fired for it. Everyone's doing it. And actually, I started a conversation. So it's good. So I think the two are intertwined, and that's why it's become like particularly pernicious in the American media landscape. I don't know what you think about that.
That's so smart. So what you're saying is like they feel free to air as long as they're airing to the left.
Yes, and I think that can be the only psychological explanation for what's happened, because I've never seen an incorrect story that portrayed Donald Trump in a flattering light. And law of averages, if it was just shoddy journalism, that would happen.
Even in conservative media?
So yes. Now, this is another important fundamental thing. I think we're definitely similarly aligned here. I rarely impugn the right-wing journalism because I expect it to be bad. No, I mean, seriously, there's no point in me sitting here and going, oh, well, Fox News is biased. Yes, of course it is. It was created specifically for the purposes of parroting Republican propaganda. The worry is now that when I see a Harvard study that shows me Fox News is more fair and balanced, which used to be a fucking joke when I was studying journalism. We used to show clips of Fox saying, look at Obama in his tan suit, you know, and fair and balanced at the bottom. And we'd all be, you know, cackling, the problem is now they are more fair and balanced than an MSNBC or CNN. You know, so I know I respect my audience's intelligence enough to know that because Fox was created to, you know, repeat Republican propaganda for the purposes of getting Republicans elected, they approach that media with a cynicism that is necessary. What they don't do, what's really sad, is when you have people go, yeah, Fox News is terrible. I listen to CNN, and you go, do you apply that critical thinking to them? And you go, well, why would I? Okay, brilliant. And that's the problem. For years, we've been told right-wing media, distrust it. Fair enough, good point. Left-wing media, we sort of implicitly believe is the better kind. And unfortunately, I don't really feel that way anymore. I think there's a lot of stuff coming out of mainstream outlets that used to have tremendous records for accuracy and breaking important stories. And unfortunately, they're just repeatedly, habitually lying to their audience, and it's all one way.
And I'll just up the ante on what you just pointed out, which is, and this is the side of follow the science, right? This is the side like we have the facts, right? Just the facts, paper of record, all the news is fit to print, like and the other side is the science deniers, right?
Yes.
So it's really, and again, I think it does come back to class and education, where when you're making mistakes of a factual level while claiming the mantle of the academy and the scientific community, what you're doing is you're undermining the authority of those institutions in a way that costs people their lives. When the CDC no longer has the authority to say, guys, look, this is in your best interest, do it, because they told you that COVID doesn't travel at Black Lives Matter protests, right? Like,
it does at Cuban ones, yeah.
Right. It does at church, but not at Black Lives Matter protests. You're going to cost people their lives. So yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there is a real accuracy problem. Again, I would say, like, going back to like the populist press and the penny press, like if there was a publication or a set of publications or like a massive industry catering to working class Americans and making mistakes on their behalf as well, and then pointing out the mistakes in the affluent liberal media, I wouldn't really have a problem with that. Like, as long as everyone is represented, partisanship is not a problem. The problem is who is getting represented, in whose interests are these mistakes being made, and it's very, very much about the elites on both sides.
Yeah. In the I've read the synopsis for your book as well, obviously. There was one aspect of it that I wanted to sort of just address specifically, and that is that you talk about how corporate incentives and the newsroom have come together. And I'm fascinated by this because I think a lot of people don't understand how that's happening, and how that's slowly, probably since Reagan, been allowed to creep in. Most news outlets were, they had to be individually profitable without, or sustainable, I should say, rather, without, necessarily, they were augmented by other things. And there was a separation of church and state, let's say. Now, unfortunately, newspapers have become, billionaire playthings, or, there are literal corporate interests coming in where you'll have a Pfizer executive. This piece brought to you by Pfizer. It's crazy. Like, I look at that and I'm like, this is satire. This is the fucking Babylon Bee or something, right? Isn't it? But no, it isn't. So tell us about that and how that's happened, because again, I think you'll have a really good perspective on it.
So, there was this sort of golden age that we all look back on fondly, this post-war era, where really it was an era of mass economic mobility for working class Americans. And there just was not that much that separated the classes from each other. Obviously, we were still struggling with issues of racial equality and so forth, even from a legal point of view. But between the 50s and the late 70s, you really had this period in which the working class, their lives were very similar to the middle class, and their lives were very similar to the upper middle class. And there was just like a lot of media that was geared towards that center. And the reason for that was, like you say, there was like corporate needs. So for example, you would have a lot of towns that were one paper towns, right? So if you have a one paper in this town, you can either get 50% of the people who live in this town, right? Because people were less sorted, right? There would be Republicans and Democrats in every town in America. You either get 50% by being like super opinionated on the side of the Republicans, let's say, or you can get 100% of the town by reporting the news straight. And furthermore, journalists have always been like much more liberal than the average American. They're sort of, and part of my critique is that liberalism has always been more around issues of identity than around economic issues. But okay, let's say, journalists were always sort of liberals, like pulling to the left, but their bosses were often people without a college degree, or people from a small town, or, their boss's boss, right? That the person who owned the paper would be either very wealthy or would be the owner of a corporation. And so they would be sort of pulling in this direction, right? And you kind of have this push and pull, like journalists would want to be crusaders. Their bosses would be like, make sure that Republicans could understand this too and could read this too. And they would meet somewhere in the center. Now, what happened over the last, first, in the, around Reaganism, and then sort of with the advent of the internet, was just the collapse of the local newspaper industry, right? You also had a lot of this sorting happen, where a lot of liberals moved to the coasts, right? Leaving sort of small town America to Republicans, right? Just this great sorting between rural and urban America. And so you have now most of the news, like the vast majority of the news is made on the coasts, and it's become very nationalized because everybody's going for that online audience, right? And people who are online, you know, you can get them to care about things that are national. It's much harder to get them to care about things that are local, especially if it's not local to them. But the thing that really had an impact was the way in which online you can, and you know this, right, from writing for the internet, you know exactly who's reading your stuff, where they're getting it, what's making it go viral. We're all using the same tricks of the trade to get our stuff to appear. And so you measure now success in terms of engagement, right? That's how you know you're succeeding, is you're getting people to read your stuff. And the most engaged readers are always the most extreme readers. Right. So what that means is that even an institution like the New York Times is now measuring its success, not based on some sort of like journalistic value or moral value, but based on how many kooks on the internet got invested enough in this article to share it to all of their kook followers, to share it to all of their kook followers. And moreover, the price you pay for getting on the bad side of those kooks, right, is enormous, right? We see now the New York Times won't even stand up for its own employees when the kooks on the internet come for them. They just throw them to the wolves, right? So basically what happened was you started to be able to measure in a quantitative way how much money your readers make, where they're located, and what they care about, and what's going to make them read an article, like how much engagement it's going to make. And so it's made everything, basically, if the journalists were pulling this way and the corporations were pulling this way, now the corporations are pulling this way too, right? The money is in the crusade, right? And so everything has sort of fallen off the edge, right? But of course, it's still money. So it's not like they're representing working class Americans. That's where wokeness comes in, you know? It's this great distraction, right? Because it generates a lot of engagement, it generates a lot of clicks, and makes white liberals feel really good about themselves without actually demanding anything from them, right?
Yeah, the performative aspect of it is fascinating, isn't it? That we can just all change our profile picture for a day, and you know, that's it. We've solved everything.
Solved it.
Yeah. You know, and then don't worry, there'll be another hashtag tomorrow. So, you know, but it's interesting you say that, because again, before I went and wrote for a right-wing website, I was at a very, very left website as well, the Daily Dot. I'm sure you've seen that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And you know, I can say firsthand what you're talking about there is completely accurate, because every day, you know, was it even Slack back then? Maybe, I don't know, whatever. But, you know, we would be in our daily little chats, and it was engagement.
Totally.
And then one of the reasons I left is they started editing my copy to put in things that were designed, if you like, to signal a particular political slant. And I said, don't do that.
It's terrible.
I said, don't do that, because that's my name. That's my byline.
Yeah.
And and they were going, well, we think it's accurate. And, you know, they would do things like Gamergate, you know, because we had to write about Gamergate and the great fucking cultural wars of 2014, of which I am a veteran and did 3 tours of Gamergate, you know. But they changed it. So it was like I said, during Gamergate, you know, and they were going, during Gamergate, which was a vicious harassment campaign against women and people of color. And I'm like, whoa. But that was predicated on the engagement it would get. It would get more engagement if that qualifier was there, because people might be going, "Ooh, what does he not think Gamergate is a harassment campaign?" Like, you know, so they used to run shit like that all the time. It was one of the reasons I left. But you know, it's a very astute observation that now to make money you cater to the lunatic fringe, because the lunatic fringe will read all of your stuff provided you do that.
Yeah, and this was very much an explicit mandate from the New York Times' new publisher in 2014, in this sort of innovation report where they were trying to figure out why they were like failing to go, you know, to really make it in digital journalism. And they literally wrote in the report, there were like 2 main things that I think have had a huge impact on the New York Times in a terrible way. The first is they said it's time to take down the Chinese wall separating business from journalism. It's the role of the newsroom to increase readership, which is essentially like breaking down that Chinese wall you talked about that's always been there. And the second thing they said was like, we need our reporters and our editors to be social media stars. They need to be out there promoting their stuff on social media. Like the report literally was like horrified to find out that there was a journalist who didn't tweet one of his stories for 2 whole days, you know? And essentially what they did was they built their own problem, their own demise, because now their reporters and their editors are social media stars and they come for their own colleagues. You know, they start these like with Barry Weiss, like they start these like huge campaigns against them. Donald McNeil, over the Tom Kahn on it with James Bennett. They got their own colleagues fired because they did exactly what the Innovation Report told them to do, which is become social media stars, have big followings that can, you know, help them promote their articles. And so the New York Times really ceded all of that authority to, you know, the worst place on the planet, which is Twitter, you know?
Yes. Yeah. And Twitter it caters to these people as well. I mean, like every feature they seem to roll out is for the benefit of blue check journalists. And,
totally.
Oh God, spare me the world where everyone's Taylor Lorenz. Like, just don't. Seriously, you've got permission to just pillow over the face me if we ever get there, because she's simply awful. And like I say,
I plead the fifth because I'm too ignorant of the subject
matter. Oh, listen, I don't blame you. I don't. This is just, I'm just throwing chum in the water for my followers. You know, she's going to be subject to her own episode. She's outrageous. But look, so because we're coming up to time, and I'm devastated. This has been like my favorite episode, and all my friends are going to hate that, because I've had loads of friends on lately, but I've been using the podcast as an excuse to catch up with friends, and it's all been cool and it's been great. But this is obviously, you know, first time I've met you and everything, and this has just been like really good conversation about this. But I like to propose solutions to problems. I think that's important, right? Because we can all be mired in misery and moan about stuff. So I want your thoughts about kind of breaking the corporate media paradigm, and how, whether or not you think things like Substack and things like this will help contribute to that.
I am not smart enough to know how to fix the problems in journalism, but so the solutions chapter in my book is based on what you as a consumer of, not you because you're a producer of news, but your listeners who are, or viewers who are consumers of news, what they can do to insulate themselves from what's happening, which is the demand that we hate our fellow Americans and the undermining of the body politic that we rely on to have a democracy. So I, you know, I'm religious. And so I feel that the most important thing we can do is insulate our hearts from becoming the battlefield of somebody else's war. And what I tell people is, when you're reading something on the internet that makes you see red, that makes you just like absolutely hate somebody because of their opinion, like someone is making money. Like someone is making bank when you feel that feeling of like, oh, I hate them. They're so wrong. Like someone has taken your heart and turned it into the place where they are turning a profit, and it's a huge profit. And what you can do is refuse to allow yourself to be co-opted by that, is to refuse to allow yourself to become a foot soldier in this war that is asking you, demanding that you dehumanize people who disagree with you. I just think that that's really the message of my book, is like, we're not going to be able to change. I mean, a lot of this is capitalism, right? Like it's either going to keep going this way or it's going to hopefully run out of steam at some point and course correct. I mean, even the New York Times seems to be course correcting a little. Like they gave a newsletter to John McWhorter, who's very much an anti-woke voice, a very, you know, rational, smart guy, like, you know, really good. So like they already seem to be noticing that something is off, and like hopefully that will continue. But again, like it's like, you know, I'm a socialist, so I'm not, you know, rah-rah about capitalism, but like we do live in a society in which like the profit motive at the end of the day is going to be something big corporations are chasing, and like that's not immoral. It's just like that journalism is supposed to be this higher calling, and right now it really isn't. The best thing that could happen would not be for these people to change, which seems unlikely, but for media to open up the door for, you know, a more populist liberal approach for working class liberals. And absent that, what also seems to be happening is that the right seems to be having a little bit taking up Trump's economic populism. You are seeing more and more of that on Fox News. And honestly, I'm okay with that too. If Fox News wants to start promoting the economic, you know, fortunes of the working class, I will consider that a win as well. Like I don't need it to be on one side or the other side. I just need it to be populist. And I know that that's probably a little bit heretical, but so I would just say, the most important thing you can do is like, have friends who disagree with you politically, like remember what a democracy is all about, and don't allow your heart to be the place where we're further divided. Become, part of the like sewing mechanism that's like trying to sew us back together.
Yeah, I certainly hope we can get there. I just think the biggest problem facing people right now is that they don't know where to go to get the truth anymore. We've kind of like devolved into like little tribalist groups where we just go and we absorb media that essentially validates things we already think and feel, because we like to feel good about our beliefs. And unfortunately, the big question I always get asked by my audience is, where do I go? What media should I absorb? Who's telling the truth? Which journalists can I trust? And I have to say, every time, the only way I make sense of it and the only way I arrive at a conclusion is I have to consume all of it and then look at the balance of, the CNN are going to lie this way, Fox are going to lie that way. And somewhere you can kind of get to as close to the truth as possible. And people don't have time to do that, especially the working class.
Why is it so important to know things? Like, that's where I sort of don't really get it. Like, to me, an ideal world is one in which people really stop reading the news and stop paying attention. And most of Americans actually don't read the news. They're totally disengaged because it's not for them. It's for the chattering and political classes. And they know that. Like, I don't know that what are things that you really need to know? Like, like need to know? Is it like really like, I don't know. Is it important?
Yeah, I mean, that's a unbelievable philosophical question. We could spend ages on that. I mean, to that point, I think I would say certainly around election time. But maybe on your day to day, I think this is where you can again come back to your point about lamenting the loss of local news.
Yeah, for sure.
And that is that I definitely need to know if a business down the street is closing. Maybe I don't need to know about how a company has lost billions of market value because China's flexing its muscles again,
Right.
So yeah, I agree. The internet is the big problem. That's where we went wrong in human development, I think, because now there is this belief you need to know everything. And we wade into these digital spaces, and American liberals basically control all the spaces. Even if you live in Britain or Hungary or wherever it is, if you want a Twitter account, you got to play by Twitter's rules, and you generally have to believe what Twitter believes. And so, unfortunately, people wade into this arena, and we feel compelled to know everything, and we get sucked into this vortex of nonsense that I agree we probably don't need to be there in the first place. I mean, I do, you do. Right. I've got things to sell. That's the only reason I'm on Twitter. I'm selling me, right? Like, I'm the product, I sell my content, I sell me. So, and I make no bones about it. That's why I'm on Twitter. When I've got enough money in the bank, I'm buying a log cabin and turning everything off, and no one will ever hear from me again. I'll live off the residuals from my books. Fuck it,
That's I think that's my dream too.
Every good journalist's dream. It's that you run a bar. It's
Goat farm in the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, my friend also recommended a ranch in Dakota. So yeah, but look, just to wrap it up, I can already tell by your eloquence that when the book comes out, you're going to be a big star. You'll be on TV,
thank you.
You're going to be.
I don't think so. I don't think they're going to want to platform this.
Well, no. So you are going to be. You're going to get a request from Tucker Carlson to be interviewed. That's happening. So that's up to you. I'll be watching and judging. No, I won't. You do you. I think I
have a lot to say to conservatives. People keep giving me a hard time for talking to conservatives. I'm like, I have a lot to say to them. Especially places like Fox, where you have like literally a captive working class audience.
Yeah.
Come on, why wouldn't you go there and be like, guys, develop class consciousness? The moment is now. The
criticism of Glenn Greenwald for doing that is quite
ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
I find it staggering.
It's embarrassing.
But you are going to be. It's definitely going to happen. I mean, you're certainly going to be a wonder on the speaking circuit. So I look forward to following your book tour. But what else are you going to be doing? Once the book comes out. I mean, do you have any plans and how you're going to promote it, and maybe other projects you're going to work on?
Well, I'll tell you the next project I want to work on, because it's the project I wanted to work on before this, and I couldn't sell it. And I'm hoping that maybe if this book's successful, I'll be able to write it, because this was the second proposal I wrote, the one for this book. The first one was for a book called A More Perfect Union, about how Americans are a lot less divided than we think. Like if you look at like polling and you go and I spent a lot of time in the Trump years in the South reporting from, multiracial communities and a lot of evangelical churches that are, working to integrate racially, and just, these tiny little towns, and things are just so different from what we imagine them to be in our coastal elite cities. And I really wanted to write a book about how Americans are just a lot less divided than we think. And I couldn't sell it. Like nobody, they were like, who is the audience for this book? And I'm like, literally everyone. So that would be sort of my dream, would be to go back to that project after this one. And in the meantime, I'm just, I'm working at Newsweek, and I'm an opinion editor. I really spend all day trying to elevate working class voices, trying to get op-eds from working class people, and represent views from across the political spectrum in the same place. And I like to say, like, the point of a debate is not really to convince people, it's to give them a choice. And I think that that's really, really important, is just to be a person who is saying, actually, I want to live in a world, I want to live in a country where there are both people who support abortion and people oppose it. Like that, an ideal America has people who are pro-life. Like, it's so weird that we lost that. Like, that whole elite liberal culture thinks that it is so right that the other side really should not exist, has no right to sort of their franchise. And so I'm just hoping to be a force, a unifying force that helps people come back to that realization, and again, stitching together the body politic back together, because we really need it.
Well, honestly, I couldn't agree with you more. Although that being said, I am secretly working on a book, working title, Our Digital Hellscape, which talks about how social media has driven everyone mentally ill. So, we want to solve the same problem, but I think we're coming at it from slightly different approaches. So we'll wait and see. But honestly, it's been an amazing conversation. It's so good to meet you. I did a bunch of research. You could tell immediately it was going to be good. And
thank you so much for having me. This was such a pleasure for me.
Yeah, honestly. And like I say, well, get used to it. You're going to be talking to a lot of people. You'll be on Joe Rogan in 3 months and you won't even remember who Richard Lewis is. So it's fine. But anyway, there you go, guys. So everyone that's watching the show, be sure to pick up a copy of Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. It's released on the 11th of November, but you can go to Amazon right now. You can pre-order it on Kindle and hardcover, and I'm sure it's going to be a great read. I've got mine. I can't wait to read it. And that, of course, was the wonderful Batya Ungar-Sargon. Throw her a follow on Twitter. It'll be on your screen down there. And that was everything from the Richard Lewis Show. So I don't know when the next episode will be. I never do. I don't know who the guest will be. I never do. But it'll be good. So make sure you tune in. And until then, take care of yourself.